Let's jump into the theory segment for the day. And this is a good one because we get a lot of questions about this. On 4 for 4, we do, and we'll break this up into a couple different small segments, but we do three types of projections for fantasy point projections. We do floor projections, median projections, ceiling projections. And a lot of people ask how they should be using those, when they should be using those. And then we do ownership projections, which when we get to the ownership part, I'll get into the specifics of what that means and the difference between the two sites. But I think a lot of people see those. And if you're new to DFS, the fantasy point projections, pretty intuitive. Ownership projections, I think people can use some guidance on how to use those properly. So we'll get into that. So first things first, let's just talk about what these different types of projections are and why they matter.
Sure. Okay. It's very basic. We're looking at opportunity statistics and then looking at what would be a lower or extremely low efficiency on that expected opportunity. And that's how we're basically, very, very basically deriving a floor projection for a player. So players with more opportunities, more targets, more rushes are going to pop up with higher floor projections regardless of the efficiency, which is much harder on a week-to-week basis to project. The median projection is probably including something around or near their current efficiency metrics, like usually in a lot of projection systems, they'll project the targets and then yards per target to predict the amount of receiving yards. Very simply like that. That's how you get a median projection, usually something around the player's average. And then a ceiling would be what is a reasonable ceiling efficiency for that position, for that player, and then adding it to an expected opportunity, maybe boosting that opportunity a little bit as well, creating a ceiling for all players. And this is the part that actually annoys me a little bit, is that everyone's ceiling projection, when viewed in a spreadsheet form, just a column, starts to feel like it's kind of similar. And so I actually think that's one of the hardest things is seeing, well, this guy's ceiling is 25 points. This guy's ceiling is 27 points. What does that functionally mean for me? And that is really where ownership gets involved here. And, you know, if there was one right answer to how to balance all four of these factors, we'd all be millionaires and this would be a very easy game. We could all go home after this one podcast and we'd be done. But ultimately what we want to do is care more about ownership the more people we're playing against and the more we get for winning first place or near it. So ultimately in big GPPs, we want to care a lot about ownership. And I wrote in my notes here, more than you think. I urge you to go back to our leverage episode from a week ago that kind of talks about being contrarian and the concept of leverage in general. Now, before we go further about what we're going to do here, a non-analytical approach to coming up with ceilings, which obviously matter in DFS a little bit more, map out the stat lines based on the game script. I'm not talking about exact stat lines, but start to get into your head, based on the platform I'm playing, what does 100 yards and a touchdown equal in fantasy points? You should know that quickly off the top of your head, or similar. What does this player actually need? And then check their box scores. Have they ever gotten scores like that before? Sometimes we can find ceiling scores that make sense when we're breaking down the matchups and looking at the opportunity, but then you go, wait a minute, they've literally never done this before, and we need to factor that in, especially if the ownership is high on that player for whatever reason.
Yeah, before we get into how we actually use these different type of projections, I will say that going back to just your explanation of them, if you're looking at 4 for 4 or almost any, probably any site that's doing good or even decent projections, that median projection, that's going to be our most accurate projection. That's going to be the most likely outcome. But that's also the one where in tournaments where when we talk about building volatility into your projections, those are the ones that we are looking for the situations where they might stray the furthest from those median projections. So that's where the floor and the ceiling comes into play. The players that have the biggest gap in floor and ceiling between those median projections, those are the high volatility players. The lower volatility guys are often players that you want in cash games, not always, and the higher volatility guys are going to often to be the guys you're going to be targeting in GPPs. Where we do see the big, you mentioned that we see these ceiling projections bunched together quite a bit sometimes. On the floor side, you often don't see them bunched together. So I think you've mentioned like Lamar Jackson a couple of times on here, and maybe even Derrick Henry, but like we'll often see that their median projection might be 1 point higher than the next guy, but their floor projection might be 2.5, 3 points higher. So when we're looking at these projections, and whether it be a fantasy point projection or an ownership projections, it's not necessarily the raw projection we're thinking about, but the relativity of it, right? So if the gap between a player's floor projection is huge, then that player is probably going to be a much safer play than another player who is projected similarly. So really, when we're thinking about in terms of safety and volatility, when we're talking about floor, median, and ceiling projections, I think we'll probably hold off on ownership projections a little bit just because it's kind of its own thing. But let's talk a little bit about your approach to using these different types of projections in cash games and tournaments. Called it the lock-in one approach.
Yeah, and this is, I'll say, this is my own personal take on it, so please take this as you will. Do your own research, as you always will. But I really have found that this approach makes sense for me. And this lock-in one approach in cash games just refers to locking in one player's floor projection and then creating lineups around that floor projection. And then on the tournament side, I'm locking in one player's ceiling projection and then creating lineups around that one ceiling projection. And ultimately, what that's doing for me is letting me see new combinations of players and then seeing where, when I look at the combined ceiling or the combined floor, and I notice big differences, as you were saying, TJ, that's where we can start to differentiate lineups that actually have a chance at first place. Because ultimately, and there's nothing wrong with building lineups this way. You can certainly win lots of money in DFS just using median projections. But ultimately, it comes down to one or two players hitting their value in cash games enough so that you can just get enough from everyone else. And in tournaments, it's one or two players hitting their absolute ceiling while the rest of your team doesn't bomb, gets you enough. Mm-hmm. Yep. So when we lock in one, we can start to build around what happens when I'm correct about this one thing. And ultimately, I'll get to this in a minute in my next point here. Yep. That's what we're aiming for with ceiling projections. When can I use this ceiling projection, and what happens when that ceiling projection actually hits?
Yep. And before we get into that ceiling, because I think the ceiling might be the name of it is intuitive. We're looking for the ceiling. I think it's probably the least intuitive in terms of how to use it correctly. But before we get into that, I think for DFS purposes, I think there is actually a lot of danger in using projections if you don't understand what you're looking at. And what I mean by that is that the thing that a median projection is fantastic for is start sit analysis. Like, I think you can take median projections, look at the player that's ranked higher, even if it's just by a fraction of a point, and play him pretty confidently. Obviously, there's some situations like a lot of times if it's a running back or wide receiver decision, sometimes just go with the running back. But I think median projections are fantastic for that, very accurate for that. For DFS, we aren't playing a game of start sit. If we were playing just a straight pick'em game and everybody and you need to just get the most number of players right and not the points, then median projections would be great for that as well. But that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to tailor our lineups to different game types. So a lot of times you'll see, and I mentioned this a little bit with the Cardinals, for example. They have such a high projection that they're going to show up in the lineup generator a ton this week. And I think people that don't play a lot of DFS might look at it and be like, well, why would you project them that high? Because that is their median projection. But you have to understand what you're trying to do in DFS and use a cash game example. Sometimes if you have a player pool, you can lock these players in, and the median projection is going to give you these lineups that might have the highest overall projection. And even if you're using floor projections, a projection just doesn't necessarily capture the nature of positions and the nature of builds and what you're trying to accomplish in a lineup. So in a cash game, if you're playing in a double up, for example, where all you need to do is beat 50% of the field, it doesn't make sense to forego, say you're on FanDuel, to forego 3 running backs that have a very high floor because your median projection says that 4 wide receivers who are moderately priced but only see like 6 targets per game or something are going to give you a higher projected lineup. So understanding things like that, understanding what you talked about with what high price quarterbacks can offer you, just because your lineup projection or your lineup generator tells you that the lineup with the $6,000 quarterback has a higher projection, that doesn't mean you should do it. I'm not saying don't use lineup generators. I'm saying understand what the lineup generator does. And we could do a whole podcast on properly using lineup generators, or we probably will. Understand what it's trying to tell you, and understand that you still have to tell the machine or the robot what to do. So selecting the right player pool, that's when you start using lineup generator correctly and using these projections correctly, at least the floor and the median projections. Let's get into the ceiling projections and how to properly use those. So you talk about the idea of playing for first place and using these ceiling projections. So what exactly do you mean by that? What exactly do you mean by a ceiling game occurring?
Sure. So when we talk about the concept of playing for first place, and I certainly didn't make up that phrase or this concept, but when we talk about that, we're embracing the volatility that we understand about each of these positions in fantasy football, because they are different in terms of volatility, and doing what we can to differentiate ourselves, again, using ownership projections, so that when we are right about a few of our ceiling games actually happening in a lineup together, we've earned enough so that we just need things to go basically like we expected, the chalk to hit, if you will, for us to reach first place or close to it. And as a side note, I write here, and something I remind myself all the time is a 3x value on a 3K player is 9 points. And it doesn't help you get to a tournament win because you hit 3x value on all your 3K players.
Yep.
And one of the things that often happens when we're using median projections is that suddenly this $3,300 player is popping in all of our lineups, because comparing their dollars per point or points per dollar, it looks better than everybody else, but it's still not going to help you get to the top unless they have a 30-point game. So really, it's about what types of ceiling performances are we chasing. And I write that they fall under two categories: players that are legitimately capable of 40-plus points, and everybody and their grandparents could probably name those players who could get to 40-plus points. We don't have to go into that. But the other one that we have to talk about is low ownership plays who need, what I say here, only a few things to go right to get to 15, 20, 25 fantasy points. And it's really funny that Deshaun Jackson has reemerged on the Los Angeles Rams, because for years he was the poster child for this ceiling archetype, because essentially he could have 3 catches, 110 yards, and 2 scores on 4% ownership, and all you needed was to just have the chalk in your lineup, and you're cashing everywhere in DFS. Ultimately, that's one ceiling game. One ceiling game changes the way that your week goes. So one little last thing I'll say is, so many people who use lineup generators are just generating lineups, letting the machine do the work, but then they are downloading that, going into Excel, going through a process where they're doing exactly this: comparing floor, comparing ceiling, adding ceiling to one player. So I encourage you to, if maybe you live in that spreadsheet life in your pre-lineup selection, and you do have access to our DFS subscription, and you're doing lots of lineup generators, try to go into those lineups and work after you've generated lineups as well.
And one thing I will say about that specifically is that you mentioned these players that, like on DraftKings, if you have a 4K player that's projected for 13 points, he's going to look fantastic in his projections. And if you have him in your player pool, he's probably going to show up in 100% of lineups. Depending on the position, maybe it's a good play, maybe it's not. And this goes back to my point about understanding how to use a lineup generator or using whatever tool you're using, is that we are still in charge of the inputs. So instead of sorting by value, say on the 4-4 lineup generator, start with whatever players you're locking in. I usually start with a stack. Sort by the ceiling projection, because then if you're sorting by these players that have an actual ceiling, you're not, even though this player is a good value, most likely his ceiling projection isn't going to come anywhere close to players that are way higher in salary than him. But by building a player pool of players that actually have high ceilings and already having the values that you believe have a high ceiling yourself, you're going to see what kind of lineups can be generated that have a true ceiling. Now, once the lineups are generated, that doesn't necessarily mean to go with the number one lineup, but you're building a group of teams that actually has a real ceiling. So I do think that is a really important point to note. I want to get into some couple notes about ownership projections, but I think you have a couple more things to say about ceiling before we get there.
That's really pretty much it. But remember that some players, especially rookies and second-year players, who are eventually going to be those first round every year wide receivers, first pop up as big ceiling games. Mm-hmm. And we can kind of point to some players that could be later on in the season. Like you could see Devonta Smith popping off for a huge amount. Or Van Jefferson. I know we mentioned Deshaun Jackson, but Van Jefferson is another player on an elite offense, second-round draft capital. And again, if you just see a couple of 30-point performances or 20-point performances, I'll be more realistic, suddenly the perception of Jefferson after 2 or 3 of those games, wildly different than it is now.
Yeah. Let's say a couple words about ownership projections. I mean, I think what an ownership projection is should be pretty intuitive. It's basically how much we expect a player to be used in a game. On 4for4, our ownership projections are reflective of large field tournaments. That's what the majority of people are playing. The difference between unless you're playing super high stakes ownership in the millionaire versus like a $3 game with 100,000 people in it, all those should be pretty similar. So we're projecting for large field tournaments, and then you can adjust based on your game. We talk a lot about that, like in our Discord, about what we think someone might be owned in a $300 single entry or something like that. But how do you typically, what's your process for looking at these ownership projections, and how are you using ownership projections in your obviously we'll stick to GPP builds here?
Yeah, I hate to say this, but I have a super nerdy process that involves code and charts and things that I don't wish upon other people. But ultimately what I'm doing is I'm comparing value, I'm comparing ceiling, and I'm comparing ownership in a graph that's easy for my data visualization based brain to understand. Because ultimately, yes, it's different for every tournament I'm playing. One thing I do, again, I'm using code to do this, but I change ownership projections for a lineup. I multiply that all together because that's the true ownership projection of a lineup. And then I change that to odds. So say 1 in 10,000 people play this lineup, 1 in 50,000 people play this lineup. And if there are more than 50,000 people in the tournament, I simply will eliminate all lineups that happen under 50,000% or 50,000% that have an expected ownership that is more than that, because it wouldn't make sense to play it in those tournaments. And so especially when I love to play 3-entry and single entry max, often you can find lineups that are actually different in terms of ceiling projections on a logarithmic scale, meaning like they're 10x more likely to hit their ceiling. And we have a great tool in the GPP leverage scores that can actually show you that as well. You can multiply those together and get a boom percent for your lineup. I mean, that's obviously advanced, guys, but that is something you can do to obviously show real differentiation. And then if you just compare that, like on the x-axis to the y-axis being ownership, you're going to see drastic differences between the lineups you create.
Yeah, the thing that that the simplest way that I'm using ownership is I'm sorting by some kind of projection type or salary, and then looking at ownership, which you can do in the lineup generator, and looking for players that are bunched together and looking for outliers. So maybe you'll see a bunch of players that are like $7,000 running backs that get similar workloads. All of them might be projected for 15+% ownership, and you have one guy that's 5%. That guy's going to stand out as a target that we want in tournaments. Another thing that I'm doing is looking at cumulative ownership, and that's going to give us our scenarios where we have the biggest leverage opportunities. As Matt mentioned, we can go back into last week's episode and understand leverage a little bit more, but by looking at whatever teams are going to be the most popular with cumulative ownership, whatever passing games are going to be most popular with cumulative ownership, we can find leverage opportunities in the running game, in opposing passing games. And what Matt was talking about, the overall lineup ownership, probably the least understood thing in ownership projections, because we want to be contrarian. We need some chalk plays. That average or cumulative ownership, which I track every week in the TJ's Take GPP review, that kind of target ownership projection for your overall lineup, that's going to let you know if you're in the sweet spot for a lineup that isn't too contrarian but can still differentiate from the field. So that's really important. Any other thoughts on ownership in the way you use it before we get out of here?
Yeah, cumulative ownership is actually a fantastic metric. It's the best proxy for doing all of that multiplying, converting to odds that I was just talking about, that I'm sure sounds nauseating to lots of you. And yeah, just adding it all up will do a lot of that same work for you. So it's a great shortcut. I like the idea of just staying in that sweet spot is the most important thing.
And I want to say one more thing. If you look at ownership projections on 4for4, we project in ranges for ownership, not absolute. And I think that's very important in understanding, because just like fantasy point projections, there is variance in ownership, especially like we've seen this season, where there's very few guys hitting ceiling ownership, like the highest guy being 25% owned. So in those scenarios, sometimes we're going to have a lot of errors in our ownership projections, not in an absolute sense. They're probably still going to fall within like 3 to 5% of what we project, but in a relative sense. So we might have a quarterback that we think he's going to be the most popular quarterback. We project him for 12.5%. But if there's a couple guys bunched really close together, he could really quickly be like the QB6 in terms of ownership if just a couple of the lineups decide that he is the play they play. And we saw that, I think it was in week 3 with Josh Allen. I didn't play much of him because I thought he was going to be chalkier. Ended up being like the QB7 or 8 in ownership, as a huge game. I would have loved him as a tournament play if I knew he was going to be the QB8. So building variance into your ownership projections, I think that's kind of what you were talking about when you're looking at the likelihood of lineups hitting is really important as well. Any last thoughts before we get out of here, Matt?
The next generation of ownership projections, I don't want to create any work that is unnecessary here, but single entry versus GPP ownership projections are for sure going to happen soon enough, because there is differences here. We should get into that in another theory segment soon.
We will get into that in another theory segment, and I have posted some stuff in the 4for4 Discord on reviewing some of those single entry trends, so make sure you're checking that out.